It's the 40th birthday of the Macintosh in the same week that Apple gets sued by the DOJ for large-scale antitrust violations. This is interesting, and I think it's interesting for far more reasons than just the existence of the antitrust suit. It's what it's going to catalyze, and I'll explain what I mean. I think there's an undercurrent of consumer demand for an alternative to the modern smartphone, but which hasn't quite yet been able to boil over in a market with such a strong monopoly, or you could say duopoly, between Apple and Samsung in the United States. But I think this DOJ lawsuit, which, by the way, has broad bipartisan support behind it, say what you will, I'm skeptical of the breadth of how antitrust laws are applied, but put that to one side. It's a bipartisan push and a bipartisan support for this DOJ lawsuit against Apple. I think it's going to catalyze consumer demand to be able to translate into action in a way that may not have been possible if they hadn't brought that antitrust suit in two ways. First of all, take a look at the examples of how the antitrust actions against Apple have already had an impact on the way they have to run their business. The Epic Games, North Carolina-based game app provider via the Apple App Store, effectively said they don't want to pay the 30% highway robbery freight charge that most app developers and Apples do. Apple came after them, kicked them off the App Store. This ended up being one of the catalysts for the EU to then demand that the Apple phones open themselves up to apps on the Apple device that aren't the Apple App Store. That's a big deal. That doesn't exist in the United States. In the United States, if you're using an Apple iPhone, the only way you're going to get an app is through the Apple App Store. In the EU, that's no longer going to be the case based on antitrust actions taken by the EU. So I think this is going to open up a series of opportunities for entrepreneurs, maybe the next generation of Steve Jobs is ironically to bring it full circle, to fill customer demand in two key areas. The first is providing a smartphone that goes out of its way to respect your privacy at a far greater degree than Apple can possibly do today by decoupling the physical device from the cloud. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand for this. Could there be some modicum of inconvenience and a trade-off? Yes. But I do think that there are a good number of customers, 20, 30, 40% of customers in the United States. We're talking about tens of millions of people at least, who would happily use a phone that gave them most of the conveniences without connection to the cloud, but that allowed your device to have the same security that you feel compared to an Apple iMessage versus Signal. The fact that so many people are moving to Signal suggests that people would, just as they move from iMessage to Signal within the iPhone, may move from the iPhone to a different phone that isn't tied to the cloud that gives them a greater degree of privacy. And I think that's the first consumer concern that's fomenting here. And the second one is, I think, consumer recognition that's slowly rising that there isn't a great degree of personal happiness that people have derived from their attachment to their smartphones. People understand that, you know what, when I was using a flip phone or even a BlackBerry, I wasn't attached to my screen as much. Yes, I have some more conveniences. Yes, I'm able to do a few things more conveniently, but I'm also less well off personally, less present in my own real-world environment as a consequence of my attachment to my smartphone. Those two things have nothing to do with the antitrust suit. But the fact that you're seeing these antitrust actions against Apple, changing the way that Apple's going to have to operate or break itself up in some way or other, at a moment where there's customer demand, both for greater privacy and for greater detachment or dependence on a smartphone, I predict in the next 5 years or so is going to open up a major opportunity for somebody to, who would have ever thought, compete directly against Apple and Samsung when it comes to the physical device of a smartphone itself. Now, that's, I think, what Steve Jobs might have said if he were alive today. He's not. But I think it's an opportunity for some enterprising entrepreneur to take on a behemoth who they otherwise couldn't have taken on, but now has a little bit of a kink in its armor with the antitrust suits against Apple. And I think that some venture capitalists who are willing to make bold bets combined with an entrepreneur who's willing to think for the long run should be able to hopefully create the next generation of a trillion-dollar company that actually challenges Apple. And the way I look at it is that's the real way you handle private sector monopolies, isn't necessarily through government action, but through private sector competition. And the threat of this lawsuit, or the actual filing of this DOJ lawsuit against Apple, could simply be one of several catalysts that actually get the private market to invest behind that alternative.